let's get going. All right. So, hey everybody, good to see you all. Today we have a guest speaker, presenter, Alex Myers. Alex is an eLab alum, I think 14. Is that right, Alex? Yeah, 14. He's going to introduce himself properly and his background. Alex has a really deep understanding of product management as a practitioner. Really very impressive, and the materials he's going to present today just look fantastic. So sort of building on what we did on the weekend, this idea of product management that Andrea got into with some background, and then project management that I talked about a bit. Alex is going to give you his perspective, and he's also going to talk about just some of the tools that he has used, that he's been exposed to, that he's developed, that how he does product management. A lot of his background, of course, is software oriented, but I think when you look at it, some of the concepts, you're going to think that now most of you, a lot of you are in software in some way or other anyway. There's some software aspect, but I think you'll see that the concepts are really quite extensible. So we're recording this, and we'll share that out later. But without further ado, then let me pass it off to Alex.
Thanks, Ken. Hey, everyone. Excited to be here. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Can you guys see my screen? Cool. So like Ken said, I did eLab in 2014 and I graduated Cornell in 2015. And I got started in entrepreneurship through a company called Dapper that we took through eLab. And I've done 3 different startups. I'm on my 3rd one right now. But in between, I worked as a full-time product manager at eBay and Compass for a bit. And so the point of this presentation is to dive a bit deeper into some of the concepts that were touched upon in your last lecture about product management, and really trying to take some of the principles that I've used as a product manager, as an entrepreneur, and try and create a simple format for you guys to apply them for your companies. So just kind of capturing some of the stuff I've done before. Right now, my full-time focus is on this company, My Workouts, which is creating the fitness encyclopedia for people to figure out where to get started so they can improve their fitness. Previously, I was a product manager at Compass, working on all sorts of different products, including the CRM, this product called Building Pages, and this tool called Marketing Center. Before that, I was a product manager at eBay, working on a lot of different parts of the buyer experience. And during college and towards the end of college, I worked on Dapper through eLab and this other company called Macrofuel, which was a meal replacement. So the idea in this presentation is to really help you with getting started in execution. So this is assuming that you really understand what your core customer problem is as a company, and that sticky piece that really people are excited about and going to build off of. And linked, I have the slides to that last lecture you looked at, which really covered a lot of great core principles of product management. And this is diving deeper into some of these planning and execution ones. So I have 8 major themes that I want to talk through in this deck, and each of them have some sub-discussion topics. And the goal here is to kind of give you that high-level overview. And in a lot of these slides, I have links to extra content that you can go and read and take a deeper dive into whatever you feel like you need more clarity on. So first, I want to talk about, what is product? Depending on who you talk to and where you work, people will define it a little bit differently. And ultimately, product management and product is really dependent on the company, the industry, and the people working at it. What I've kind of gathered as my definition of product based on my mentors and people I've worked with, there are 3 kind of key pieces that go into it. So the first one is really understanding and defining customer problems. At the end of the day, as the product manager, that is the #1 thing you need to do. If you don't have the right problem, then all the work that you're doing for solutions is likely not going to work. The second core principle to product management is really owning the execution for the solution to customer problems. And what I mean by that, it doesn't mean that you were coming up with a solution or that you were building something or designing something, but you are owning the entire process of being able to deliver a solution that is helpful and meets customer needs. And that boils nicely into the last piece, which is enabling your team to be successful. So as an entrepreneur, you have your hands in everything. You are doing the business plan, you're doing a lot of product work, maybe you're doing some engineering or some product development that's not software development. But ultimately, as a founder and as a product manager, your number one goal has to be helping your team to be successful and get things done. So the way I want to approach a lot of this presentation is thinking about it in a funnel. So starting at the top where you have these big ideas, your massive customer problem that is on fire that you got to deal with, and breaking that down into smaller chunks all the way down to the bottom where you're actually executing and iterating, building out that fully fleshed product. So first, we're going to dive a bit into kind of aligning on what you're doing and then breaking that down into smaller problems and ideas. And once you have this whole list of all these things you want to do, you want to be able to prioritize them. So you do the most important things first and utilize your resources well. Once you have a priority order of what you're going to do, you need to actually flesh out what it means to get that done. And that's where requirements, hypotheses, and metrics come into play. The next part, we want to talk about how you manage that execution, because having a great plan is obviously very important, but managing that execution can get tricky, especially when you have a lot of different people working on the team. And then the final piece is analyzing that product usage and iteration. So ultimately, you have this plan, you know how to execute on it, you start executing on it, but knowing how to continue to move forward and using customer feedback and customer data to help tell that story. So the first piece of aligning on what you're doing, I like to use this framework called V2MOM. So what is V2MOM? This was developed by Mark Benioff, who's the founder and CEO of Salesforce. And he created this way back when in 1999 when they got Salesforce started. And the focus of it was to help detail what you want to do, to get your team aligned, and have simple guidance to your North Star. As a founder and as a product manager, there's always a bunch of things that you want to do. But ultimately, you are not doing it alone. You have to get a bunch of people on board. And a V2MOM is really helpful for having something simple that lays out what you're trying to do and how you're going to get there. So what does V2MOM actually mean, aside from kind of a silly name? What it really stands for is vision, values, methods, obstacles, and measures. So when I say vision, what it means is like, what do you want to achieve? What's that North Star and that ideal end state that you have? So the values, what's important to you? So this is kind of more subjective and qualitative pieces. So is it friendly? Is it authoritative, etc.? The methods is, how do you get to this North Star? And it does not have to be specific to products that you build or software. It could be hiring a team or having the best data or having the best knowledge. Then there's obstacles. So what's preventing you from being successful? So do you have the right resources? Do you have the right tools, etc.? And then finally, measures. How do you know how do you know that you have it? And so I want to walk through an example. This is the first V2MOM that Salesforce made back in 1999. And so I've made a bunch of these through eBay and through my own startups. And at eBay, they would use this throughout the entire organization. So they would, for the year, have a V2MOM for the entire company. And then each sub-organization would have broad or more specific V2MOMs that are still fairly broad, down to the team level where the PM and the engineers have their own V2MOM. Now, this was pretty massive and convoluted, and it really diluted from the point of this framework. But here you can see like this massive billion-dollar company, Salesforce, started with a single piece of paper to really outline what the heck they were trying to do. And so if we look at this, their vision was to create world-class internet company for Salesforce automation. The values, very simple: have a world-class organization, get to market, have it functional, have Amazon quality, and value-added partnerships. If you look at some of these methods, some of this is very product specific, some of it is company and team oriented. So the first one being hiring a team, but then diving deeper into finalized product specifications and knowing what exactly you're going to do, rapidly develop the product, etc. Some of these obstacles was having developers and having product manager and business development people. And finally, having the right measures. So making sure that they know that they've achieved success. So having a prototype that's great, having a high quality functional system. And the last one I particularly like, one of their measures was they are all rich. It's a great measure to have. One thing that's really important to note with V2 Mom, as a founder, you should not be doing this by yourself. This is a really great team building exercise. So as the product person, as the founder, you should have a general idea of what you think would go in here. And maybe you have a draft, but I recommend not showing that draft to the team and really bringing folks together to make this, because the value of having a team is having everyone bought in and aligned. And it's a lot easier to align people when they are a part of that process and they feel like they're contributing to the vision. Sometimes you might do this and they're contributing ideas that you've already had, but that's okay. That means that you're on the same page and it gives them more emotional stake in the vision in the company. So now we need to segue into what to build. So you have this vision, you have values, you have a general idea of what you're going to do, and you have this massive customer problem that you're now attacking. Now you need to build something to address these customer problems. So I want to talk about how you break down your problems and ideas into more tangible things that you can do. So in order to get to these more concrete problems in product work, there are a bunch of sources that this can come from. You can use methods from your V2 Mom. So if some of the methods are specifically product or software oriented or product development and business oriented, being able to grab from there. You can also use competitive analysis, and this can come in the form of indirect and direct competitors. And I talk a lot more about this in the linked article on researching your product area, which is a separate article I wrote about how to go about this, and I did a presentation on for more information. A really big important piece to getting concrete problems in product work is your customer feedback. So all these customer discovery interviews that you've been doing, understanding the workflows and some of the solutions that folks are already using that as a source of inspiration for the concrete problems in product work. And then finally, domain expertise. So as a founder or as a product person, ideally, you have rich knowledge in the domain of whatever you are working on. Or if you don't have that domain expertise, you're starting to build it up and you have people within your team or accessible to your team to help build up that knowledge. So if you're building a real estate solution, ideally, you know real estate very well, or you have someone involved that is an expert in real estate. So from all these sources, you now have some problems and ideas, but now you need to prioritize them, because at the end of the day, there's only so many hours and so many people to get things done. And so although you might have 10 or 100 things that you want to do, you can probably only realistically do 1 or 2 things at a time really well. And so I want to talk about this framework called RICE that is used in product management to help prioritize. And I know you guys might be familiar with the sunflower methodology. That's something I'm actually personally using on my own startup. And I feel that's really good at like a high level business strategic. RICE is really good at the product level where maybe you have 10 or 20 product ideas or problems that you were trying to prioritize. And this can really help you to create a sequential list so you know exactly in what order you want to attack things. So RICE stands for reach, impact, confidence, and effort. And there's this article that I linked to from Intercom that talks about how you can create a RICE score for every single item that can help you quantify the level of importance or prioritization that each item should have. This is good if you're not really sure how to balance things. I personally do RICE kind of more in my head and don't necessarily use the formula. This is something that you start to develop a muscle for as you're doing more product and founder related work. But diving a bit deeper, RICE stands for reach. It's the number of people or events. So what is the breadth of things that can be affected by the work? So the next one is impact, which is how much an individual is affected. So does it kind of minorly affect their workflow, or does it have a completely astounding change? Confidence is the likelihood of success. So having a pulse on whether you have enough evidence to say, like, we really know that this feature or this work is really going to make an impact, or whether it's more of a gamble and you're shooting for the stars. And then finally, effort. So how much work will it take? So is it as simple as creating a Facebook group and you can use existing tools, or do you have to build something from scratch? And so with all these and with the RICE score, you can effectively start to put a sequential order on these different things that you want to do. So now you have this right score, you have all these different ideas, you are trying to prioritize them to figure out what you're going to do first, second, third, etc. Reiterating some of the points I was making before, at the end of the day, your resources are finite and you have to be super, super diligent about using them properly. You only have so many hours in the day, you probably only have so many dollars in the bank account, and you need to make it count. And so using prioritization is really an effort to focus your efforts. I keep mentioning sequential lists. It's really important to actually put a number against each item you do. It's really easy to prioritize a list and say, I want to do 5 things right now. At the end of the day, you probably can't do that. And so putting a number 1 on something and a number 2, they could be very closely tied together, but really being brutal about what comes first and making sure you get that done well. And I know as an entrepreneur, and something to talk about a lot in eLab is doing MVPs. Whenever you're approaching product work and features, you want to try and do the MVP of a feature. And so what do I mean by that? You want to be doing the minimum viable product of a feature, because similar to entrepreneurship, it might not work, and often it won't work. In the last presentation you guys watched, there was discussion about hypothesis testing and that you're approaching these things like scientific experiments, and that's totally accurate. But with that in mind, if you're doing all of this hypothesis testing, you need to test quickly and you need to test with the minimum amount possible to provide value. Because often if you try something and it doesn't work, you don't want to go and have built all these bells and whistles that might add a ton of scope to delivering this to customers, only to realize that this wasn't worth doing at all and you need to kill the product or the feature entirely. This last piece, this phased approach, it's really helpful to think about product work and feature work from a North Star and then work backwards. So what are the key things you have to have, that phase 0 or that MVP? And then what are some of the things that you can tack on for a phase 1 that adds a lot of extra value, but isn't necessarily critical to see success? Phase 2, phase 3, etc. Ultimately, it's starting to think about how do you iterate and how do you invest further in the product. So now you've prioritized, you have all these things you want to do, you have an idea of what an MVP of a feature is, and now you're setting down, you're going to go start building things. But before you build, you actually need to know exactly what you're building. Having a line item in a Google Sheet saying like, build X is nice, but it doesn't really paint the whole picture. And so this is where creating requirements comes into play. So there are a lot of different parts to creating requirements, and I know this was touched upon a good deal in your last lecture. And what I wanted to try and do is really focus on how do you actually create this, and I broke it down into 4 pieces, and we're going to talk about each piece in some of the following slides. But the 4 most important pieces that go into requirements are customer problems. So it's breaking down that mega problem that the company is addressing into smaller, more concrete problems for each product or each feature that you're doing. And I'll talk about this a bit more, but I like to think about this in terms of like who, what, when, where, why, and how, to make sure I'm covering my bases. The next piece that you want to think about is hypotheses and analytics. So these customer problems and you have a general idea of what you want to build. You should have an idea of what you expect or want to have changed with this product work that you're doing. And then you want to be able to actually measure that change. The next piece is user stories. So I know in your last discussion, you talked a lot about user stories, and I think this was really described well in talking about kind of the scenario, the motivations, and the outcomes. There are other ways of going about this. Sometimes user stories are formed in a persona perspective. I like to use something called a job story, which really does capture what was described to you before, but is a bit more concrete on workflows as opposed to personas. And sometimes it might be referred to as a user flow. And then the last piece is executing the work. So you have all these requirements flushed, and now it's time to project manage the team and help them get to success and finalize execution. So customer problems. This, as the product person and the entrepreneur, is the most important piece. I like to think through kind of who is the customer, what is the workflow of the customer, like what are they doing, when is the customer doing this workflow? Where are they doing it? Why are they doing this workflow? And how are they getting it done right now? And this seems fairly redundant, but the reason for being this thorough is there are nuances that make a big difference in your product. So for example, if you were to build something for a construction worker, all right, who is the customer, the construction worker, but what is the workflow of the customer? Maybe they are creating a design for something that they're working on. But when or where is the customer doing this? If they're doing it on the go, then this all of a sudden is a mobile app problem, as opposed to if they're doing it in their office, then maybe it's a desktop computer problem. So these little things completely change how you go about creating a solution for this. Yeah, so kind of moving along. The next piece is having hypotheses and analytics. So you have these customer problems and you have a general idea of what you want to build, but now you need to know, like, what is going to happen when I build this? So the hypotheses, I like to frame this in a funnel as well. So starting really high level at a human level, and then getting deeper into the product level where we're actually measuring it. So when I'm forming hypotheses around some product work, I'm noting what the expected change to the workflow is at a human level. So what this means is, you could solve some of these problems you might be doing as a software development company without software. So if you're trying to connect people, you might use Facebook, but you could literally just mail people envelopes and connect them that way and have them meet in person. So when you're thinking about hypotheses, ignore the software, just really think about what's happening at that human level. Going a level deeper, once you understand what's changing at that human level, now you want to start thinking about what's actually happening in the product. So this is where you're forming metrics. So this is supposed to show what changes are occurring in the workflow within the context of the product. And you want to think about this in success metrics and failure metrics, because not everything you do is going to work. And you want to make sure you've clearly thought through what's going to happen if we're successful and what's going to happen if we're not successful, so that you can learn how to iterate. And then finally, analytics. So you have your hypotheses and your metrics. The analytics are the literal tags that you might drop in your software so that you can measure your metrics. So this might come in the form of tracking when someone comes to the site, or tracking when a user logs in, or when they come back multiple times. And these analytics will help inform the metrics and whether you're successful in executing these hypotheses. I want to talk a little bit about user stories, job stories, user flows. So in your last lecture, the discussion was talking about this, where you were just speaking to the actual workflow and the motivations of the user, and not talking as much to the actual user flow or some of the UX. And I think in an ideal world, this is amazing if you can get away with that. In reality, when you're doing software development, especially when you have less resources in a smaller team, sometimes you have to get more granular than just saying what the workflow is. But that doesn't mean don't state what the workflow is. It just means you might have to go a bit deeper than you might in an ideal state. But the key point of user stories and job stories is really capturing the workflow and the motivations, and detailing the customer scenarios and the outcomes. And so I like to use a job story, which really has a solid framework and makes sure I'm covering my bases. So this is similar to the user story format, but it really doesn't index as much on the persona. The persona is good for understanding the types of people that you're working with, but it's really about their workflow. So when I'm doing some workflow, I want to have something happen so that I can achieve a specific outcome. And here I've linked to a great article on Medium that dives deep into job stories and how that can be applied both for technology and not technology. So now you have some of these user stories or job stories, and there's a lot of different ways that you can frame that in your requirements or in your project management tools. And so this was detailed a bit in your last lecture, but I wanted to talk a bit more about some of the ownership of these different types of stories and how it actually comes into play in execution. So my guidance is, take everything I'm telling you on this with a grain of salt. Ultimately, there's not one right way of doing this, and you need to figure out what works best for your team, especially as a founder with a small team and less resources. Everyone's owning the work, and you have to be flexible on how these things are operated. So what I like to do in my software development is I start with an epic, which is the high level grouping of work. And I try to limit this epic to a new feature and a phase of that feature. So some people will maybe create an epic for an entire product like search. But what ends up happening is you are likely going to continue to iterate on search many, many years. And so then you have this epic that just stays open forever. Whereas if you were able to cap it at specific feature work or phases of that feature work, then you're able to close it and it just helps you have a cleaner backlog of items. Generally speaking, product should own this, but again, it really is dependent on your team. So the next level down is the user story or job story user flow. So in an ideal world, it's literally just the user motivations, what they're trying to do, and the outcomes. In practice, generally, as a product person, you're probably going to need to detail specific flows as well. And depending on how you write stories, maybe this is purely in the acceptance criteria, or maybe it is as separate tickets. Ultimately, it's about finding a system that works for you and your team. Lastly, there's engineering tasks. So this is specifying, okay, like we want to build this feature and maybe this user experience. We need to make a button. We need to make a new service. We need a new framework, etc. In an ideal world, the engineers are writing these tickets, but again, it really depends on your team and maybe you write that with them as well. Ultimately, it's about making sure that your team is organized and understands what to do. So now you have all these requirements, you have these tickets, hypotheses, analytics, etc., and it's time to actually get the work done. So what I want to talk about next is the different tools that I use to get my product work done. And I use all of these both at established companies like eBay and Compass and at my startups like My Workouts and Macrofuel. So the tool that I use for my requirements is Google Docs. The reason I really like this is it's just super flexible and easy to collaborate, and it's easy to share to folks. Some people use Confluence in Atlassian's tool set. The problem is if you don't have a Jira account, it's a lot harder to share, and generally you'll have stakeholders who aren't necessarily in the Atlassian product suite. For ticketing, I like to use Jira, though some people use Trello or Asana. I've used all three for different projects. And for software development, I think Jira is the best. For not software development, Trello or Asana is really great. And then lastly, for analytics, I like using a combination of Google Analytics, Heap Analytics, and Full Story. So talking a little bit more about requirements and requirement documents. So when you're creating this, you'll sometimes hear it referred to as requirements, spec, product requirement documents, or PRD. These are all the same thing. They're interchangeable. Like I was saying before, just use Google Docs. It's free, it's simple, it's easy to permission. There's no point in reinventing the wheel. And when you're writing requirements, you get really detailed. You might start including things like Google Slides or Google Sheets, and Google Docs plays really well with these. When I'm writing my requirements, these are the source of truth. You want everything detailed here, from the customer problems to the hypotheses to the user stories, designs, and a research and competitive analysis. This makes it easy to have a source of truth that you can share out to anyone and not necessarily have to go and search through emails or Google Drive to find exactly what you're looking for. And so ultimately, you should make your requirements document work for your team. Linked here, I have a spec template that I made that has descriptions of what each section is and how you can go about it. Feel free to make a copy and use that at your discretion, and you can chop things up or make your own. And one other thing to note, I've also linked a template design brief. So depending on your team and who you're working with, sometimes you need to write requirements that are specific to a designer to help them wrap their head around a project. And so a lot of this is duplicative of elements of the PRD template, but this is something that was created by my designers at eBay that dives deeper into some elements that are really specific to designers, like the tone of the experience or how this complements the brand. So coming back to ticketing software, Jira, Trello, and Asana are the top three. I've used Asana most recently for my workouts, but I'm in the process of moving my engineering team to Jira. The reason for this is I think Jira is best when you're engineering focused. It has really great support for epics, stories, and tasks, whereas Trello and Asana, you can hack it together, but it's a little bit tougher. The main downside of Jira is it's really difficult to configure and it's not that friendly. Asana and Trello are super flexible and easy to configure. And the free tiers on all of these is pretty great overall. So when you're looking at the data and trying to measure success in your products, you definitely want to be having dashboards that you're constantly referring to. And I like having them in a mix of Google Analytics, Heap Analytics, and Full Story, because each of them is really good at different things. So Google Analytics is great for demographics data, and it's always free and has really great tie-ins with other Google products, which will come into play when you're starting to think about testing, if you want to use Google Optimize, or if you're looking at your Google presence like in SEO, this ties in really well with Google Webmaster Console. Heap Analytics is not as great with demographics data, but it's awesome for making easy dashboards. So generally, if you want to do tracking, the engineers have to drop tracking tags within the code, and Heap makes it so you can use an event visualizer and just click on something on the page and say, I want to track that. And so as a product person or as a founder, it removes the bottleneck of having to write requirements for analytics to track and having the engineers do that. Heap's free tier is really great. It's just super useful and easy to use. This last one, Full Story, is one of the most powerful tools I've ever used. You can literally watch user sessions. So I can go onto my Full Story dashboard and say, show me all user sessions for someone who hit the homepage, and I can literally go and watch them. The downside is the free tier is pretty limited and the paid tiers are super expensive. So I would use this for if you're trying to isolate a certain issue and figure out where is it breaking and where is my analytics not covered. If you can eventually afford Full Story, the full product, I highly recommend getting it. At Compass, they use the Full Story paid suite, and it was really helpful as a product manager. So now I've given you a ton of information about how do you get aligned, how do you figure out what you're going to do, how are you prioritizing and creating requirements and starting to get it all done. Now we need to tie it all together into how do you operate your day-to-day and figure out how to build stuff fast with your team. So what I want to talk about is this thing called the Agile Manifesto. So some of you might have heard of something called Agile development, and that has come from this idea of the Agile Manifesto. Ultimately, it's four simple concepts. It's individuals and interactions over processes and tools, having working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. I'm going to dive a bit deeper in the next slide, but ultimately it means I've shown you a lot of stuff about processes and tools that you can use. Take it with a grain of salt. At the end of the day, no one cares about what your process is. They care about, do you deliver value to your customer? So focus on making sure the customer's happy and that the product works. Also, this other piece is basically making sure that you're having a good relationship with the customer as opposed to nickel and diming over contracts. And the last piece is being flexible. So don't go in with a 10-year plan and only operating on that. Realistically, it's going to change a lot, and you need to be able to be flexible enough to adapt to that change. So how do you take this into practice with your own company? So first, have a plan. And that's what we were talking about with the V2MOM and RICE and prioritization. Then you want to use all these different concepts we've talked about to have a framework for executing with the team. When it comes time to actually execute, I highly recommend working in 1 to 2 week sprints. On one of my last teams at Compass, we did 1 week sprints, which was really nice because as an engineer, it's really stressful if you get 5 requests during the week and you have to constantly change what you're working on. But if you have weekly planning, everyone sits down on Monday and you look at, these are the different tickets we have to get done. And the engineers know, all right, for the next 5 days, this is my focus. And this way you allow the engineers to really sit down and focus and get stuff done, but you have enough flexibility as a founder or as a product person to course correct fairly quickly the following week. Now, that's not to say if something's really screwed up that you can't course correct in the middle of the week, but generally speaking, it's better to not have a ton of churn. And the next piece in here, so when you're starting these 1 to 2 week sprints, have your requirements and tickets ready to go at the start of the sprint. If you're doing a kickoff with your engineers or your team and you don't have everything flushed out, they're going to sit on their hands and not know what to do. So make sure you as the founder and the product leader are ready to go. The next piece is actually reviewing these requirements and tickets with the team. So don't just message someone on Slack a ticket or send a doc and say, read it and do it. Literally go through it with them, have them ask questions, make sure they understand all the details, have them point out anything that they think might be wrong and help contribute to that plan. Because generally these folks will be really smart in an area and might see something that you haven't seen. Number 5, make sure the team members are contributing to what they take on. So it's a lot better to have someone say, or asking someone on your team, hey, what do you think you can get done this week? As opposed to saying, can you get these 5 things done? Realistically, they might not have time for those 5 things, but also from a team bonding perspective, people having a say in what they do and having ownership to be able to say, I have capacity for this, helps build that trust and helps your team move faster. You as the product person and entrepreneur really need to be constantly checking your dashboard. So you should know quickly if something is broken, and ideally your dashboards are set up in a way where it's painfully obvious that something is not working or that something is working. You want to regularly talk to your customers. There are plenty of things that are going on inside of their heads that you are not going to be able to pick up from an analytics dashboard or even full story. You might see that something fails on the page, but you don't know why or what's going on in their head. So constantly having a feedback loop with customers. This next piece, you want to prioritize work based on customer feedback and data. So sometimes you need to stay the course, and sometimes you find something out from the data or from a customer interview that completely changes how you're viewing a product and makes you realize that you need to adjust your plan. This next part, kill features or go deeper into features based on the team, feedback, and data. So if the team comes back to you and says, we think we can do this thing really well, we need a week, that's a signal to go deeper. Or if you have feedback from customers that you've really nailed something or that you missed the mark, this can help paint the picture of whether you keep investing beyond the MVP of a feature or whether you say, hey, actually, this is not worth our time. Let's do something else on the roadmap. And this last piece, have a North Star, but be flexible. Ultimately, as a founder, as an entrepreneur, and a product person, you need to have a vision, and the entire team needs to have that vision and be marching towards that North Star. But ultimately, things change. Like if you look at Brex, they were not a credit card company to start. Or if you look at Segment, they were not an analytics company to start. So keep marching, do your work, but be flexible and open to these new opportunities. So that's everything I have for you. And I've left my contact information here in case you guys want to reach out. I'm happy to answer specific questions or do one-on-one sessions with you if you have questions specific to your company. And I have a shameless plug. Please go check out my website, myworkouts.io, and send me feedback.
Oh, Alex, that was just phenomenal. So let's start here and ask if anybody wants to ask any questions now in a group. And I'm going to start with one because the advice I gave the other day, and I'm glad you contradicted it, was to think about 3-week sprints. But I like the way you framed it. In the last org I was at, Discovery, we worked in 3-week sprints. It sort of matched the business cycle, but indeed, you're right. There's room for interruption within a 3-week sprint. By the time you get to the end of the second week, people might get shifted around to something else. So, yeah, I thought that was interesting. I mean, I guess my question is, when we're working with teams that are mostly students, is there enough hours in a 1-week sprint to actually get enough done? But maybe there is. So I really thought that was an interesting perspective.
No, I think that's a good point you bring up. So like when we did Dapper, we did 3-week sprints. And the reality is, you're right. As student entrepreneurs, your time is a lot more limited. And what someone who's full-time, not in school, can do in a week is very different than someone who has prelims and classes. So ultimately, it really comes down to how much time can you dedicate. So if you're putting in 10, maybe 20 hours a week, probably do more than 1-week sprints, do 2, maybe 3. I caution against 3, even though we did it way back when. It's slow to course correct. And you will, even if you can't put in as many hours each week, you'll learn more in 3 weeks than you would think. And you want to have that flexibility and that rhythm. And ultimately, you might come to sprint planning and say, hey, like we didn't get everything done, we're going to keep doing it, and that's fine. But it at least has an opportunity to make adjustments.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So does anyone have any specific questions that they'd like to ask Alex at this point?
I have a quick question.
Go ahead, Chelsea.
Oh no, yeah, sorry. Someone thought I was talking to him in my office. So we talked a little bit about, or Alex, you talked a little bit about the customer workflow, and I was wondering, based off of like, you have a bunch of different customers who fit into one segment, but maybe their workflow flow is different. How do you account for that in, I guess, your product development?
Yeah, so you have to, this comes back to prioritization and picking the ones that you're going to address. Ultimately, you should try to address all of them over time, but when you're building product, it's very rare that you can build one thing that meets like 5 different workflow needs. And so that comes back into rice of, all right, if I have a similar customer segment, but that's 5 different workflows, maybe that's 5 different customer segments in itself. But then going through and prioritizing each workflow and figuring out which one you're going to address first. I'm messaging the link to the deck in the chat for those of you who want it. Are there any
I'll
other
share it out on cam. I'll share it out in an announcement. Thanks.
Awesome.
Anyone else? Any other questions? Clarifications of terms or technology or thoughts on how you want to apply this? Nobody? I'm shocked, actually. All right. All right. Well, go ahead, Alex.
Sorry, I was going to say, if you guys have questions later, feel free to message me. Happy to chat more.
Yeah, I'll share out your contact information also. Use my workout address.
Yeah, you can use that.
Okay, great. Cool. So that's what we had for today, actually. I thought there might be a few more questions. That's okay if there aren't.
I actually have one more question.
Yeah,
Sorry.
go right ahead then.
This is about the sprints. So, I guess I'm a little. It's okay. So it's hard to. It can be challenging to get your team together sometimes when everybody's a student. So like how much, I guess, yeah, how much of this expectation should we like have on our team in this case where, our school sometimes consumes our entire life?
Totally. Yeah, I think, if you can find a time slot that can account for most people, go for it. And maybe you have to adjust it certain times. Like you don't have to be super, like it's okay if you're not weekly sprints, like maybe one is 2 or 3 weeks because everyone's crazy busy. And for people who can't attend, if it's consistently they can't attend, I'd figure out a way to adjust it so that more can. But like with the folks that I've worked with, sometimes we just use Slack. Slack is more common, like when we're doing a daily stand-up, which I don't recommend to student entrepreneurs because you have too much going on. But you'll have a daily stand-up where everyone kind of says, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm going to get done, this is where I'm blocked. And sometimes they'll message that over Slack. But in the sprint planning purpose, you could potentially do that, or maybe you meet with someone separately. The one thing I'd caution on meeting with separately, you need to be super diligent with your time and you need to be selfish with your time. If you have to have 5 meetings where you say the same thing, then that is less time that you were spending on the business. And so trying to balance that. But if you are really clear with your requirements and you have things tagged correctly, in theory, you can say, look at this section of the requirements, look at this filter on Jira and message me with questions, which obviously is not ideal, but it's about getting stuff done at the end of the day.
Other folks? All right. Well, I'm not gonna. Max?
Yes, I sort of just wanted to ask because I think it's really cool that you've worked at both big companies and smaller startups in a PM role. And I sort of just wanted to learn more about how you sort of like pick your North Star metrics, and then once you actually pick them, how if one of them is failing, or if, let's say, it has to do with daily active user growth and you're not growing as quickly as you wanted to, how you go back and then change things with your team.
Definitely. So in terms of the North Star for like a product or a company, you need to, this kind of comes back to like that top of the funnel piece, like what are you actually trying to do there? And so if you're trying to just have more people using the product, daily active users sounds like a great one. But if you're looking at your dashboards and you're like, okay, my daily active users is not going up, that's where having deeper analytics is super helpful. So you need to dig deeper and say, what are the metrics that go into a daily active user? So for your product, if that's logging in, or if that's clicking a certain button or whatever, then digging deep and seeing, are people doing these actions, or is only one action happening? And that's where you become a detective and you're trying to dig deeper. And if you don't have an answer, then it's going back and talking to folks and adding more tracking so that way you can get a better picture on that. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I also sort of am interested in learning how you do that for like when you're running an entire startup and you've got so many different metrics you can be looking at, and maybe when you're working in one branch at eBay, working as a PM for a specific product line or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. I've actually really struggled to kind of zoom up and zoom down with that. And it really depends kind of where I am in my career with that. But ultimately, it's about having focus and saying like, all right, like I have 100 ideas, write them down. And then, maybe use the sunflower methodology or rice to basically say, okay, we like all 100, but we can only focus on 5 right now, or only focus on 2. And ultimately it's about having focus. And there are times that you literally have to project manage yourself and just like say, hey, like, I'm not at big company level right now. I'm at product level. I need to ignore these other things and just really focus on that. And ultimately, if you have a team, it's helpful to be able to have people have certain focus areas, because ultimately, as the founder, you can't have your head wrapped around every single detail. Like, it's impossible. And so being able to lean on certain people for certain smaller areas to really own that. You also just kind of build up that muscle over time. I think looking back, it was easy, like when I was doing Dapper and that first startup, like, this is the high level metric we care about. It was a lot harder to dive deeper. Once I started doing more product work and thinking about specific products, I started to build that muscle and get really granular. But I'm happy to chat with you more about it separately.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I had one as well.
Yeah, Jake.
So when we talked about like creating requirements for the team, one part of that was like understanding the user workflows and user stories and stuff like that. So as like, if you're a leader of a team and you're the one, talking to customers and understanding the workflow, say you understand like there's a big change in the workflow right now, like how do you communicate that with your team? Like what's the best way to sort of show that?
Yeah. Honestly, it's really bringing them into it. So I, both as someone working at a company and as like a leader, have really, like, when I'm working at a company, I've always really respected when like a leadership team kind of brings you into those details and shows you it. And so as a leader, like, your job is to help the team be successful. And sometimes that means shielding them and not showing them everything. But if there's a radical change, I have found that like my teams, like as the PM with engineers or as the leader of a company with people reporting, they appreciate and get on board when you literally are like, look at this with me. So if that's a metric, or maybe that's a full story session, or maybe you're doing customer interviews and you just did 10 interviews and you heard, oh crap, this is completely changed and is very different. If you have notes on it, or if you have recordings, or best case, you bring them to an 11th interview and you have them listen to it, that's how you get them bought in. So like at Compass, I had a designer that wanted to design a feature a certain way that I knew was not going to work. and I could not get him to understand. So I brought him to a bunch of agents, and we talked to 5 agents. And after the 3rd one, he's like, all right, I get it. And you know, that's ultimately the best way to do it. And I guess coming back to communication in general, this is something that I've been working on even recently, keeping it simple. I think it's easy to get like distracted where like we have so many things going on in our head and so many different things that's happening at the company. But as an audience, we are not in your head and we don't have all the information that you have. And so can you dumb things down to simple bullet points that are succinct and easy to understand? And sometimes that means you're leaving out certain details, but that's okay. If someone needs more information, they'll ask for it and you can dive deeper, but just having something really clear and succinct.
Thank you.
I can't, I totally agree, and I can't state enough the idea of everyone understanding the customer. I mean, I was, you know, many years ago, always dragged along to customer visits, and I made a career out of really wanting to work with people and then hiring people who didn't want to just be order takers of, you know, do this, but actually really enjoyed and engaged with the customer. And then, you know, that sort of story that Alex has told, that everyone kind of provided the same information, either comes to the same conclusion or provides a really good challenge, but they're better armed to discuss why they think their opinion or their view is different, but they're not, you know, it's not just a guess, it's because they actually have customer data, you know, they've actually talked to the customer. So, you know, for all of you, as you're early now and later on, don't turn engineers into order takers, or programmers into order takers. I would actually encourage you. Those kind of, I mean, there's companies where that makes perfect sense, but I've tried to A, stay away from it, and B, sort of teach people the other side of it, and really wanted to be with technical people who wanted to be in front of customers.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I've had engineers at eBay and Compass that mix from, just lack of better words, code monkeys versus like really diving into the product and challenging it. And you'll have both on your team, and that's okay. The ones who want to dive in, encourage it, get them to dive in. They're going to be your strongest contributors. And, you know, the code monkeys, give them as much knowledge as possible, try and get them to buy in. But ultimately, sometimes they just want the requirements in the code and you can't change them.
Anyone else want to jump in while we have Alex here? Going once, going twice. All right, Alex, can't thank you enough. I'll shout out your information. Some folks might reach out. The sort of 40-minute tour of product management you just got was just awesome. That really pulled a lot together. I would look through the deck, look at the other links. It's a really misunderstood discipline, and it's not taught very well. Cornell Tech is one of the few places that actually teaches it. It's a thing, as they say. You know, sales is a thing, engineering is a thing, product management is a thing. It's not just the person who has a title gets to decide what to do. So you're all the first product managers. You, as leaders of the company, you automatically become product managers, and down the road you're going to hire product managers if your idea takes off. Okay, with that, don't need to keep you any longer. We will see you tomorrow for board meetings, advisory board meetings. You could expect some communication from, I think Adam put in some stuff, so it should all be in your calendars and you should be good to go. So we'll see you tomorrow in those meetings, and otherwise, if you want to hang around for questions, you can. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow.
Actually, I think I just thought of one more question, Alex.
Yeah, go for it.
So you showed like one of the first V2 moms. I think it was, you might have said it was the first one that somebody made.
Yeah.
And you said it like wasn't really perfect. What does like a better one look like a more modern?
No, sorry, I might have misstated that. I think it was a very good one. The point was that it was succinct and simple, which kind of comes back to what I was saying before. Like, no one can digest all the information in your head, and so they basically all sat down and this massive, very successful company just said like, this is it. And it was very short. The part that I was saying was not well done. eBay would do V2 moms and they would turn into these 10-page documents and they would have it at like every level of the organization. And that was not helpful. When I looked at it separately from eBay, I was like, oh, this is great. So simple and clear is the move.
Okay, actually, yeah, I think I just misheard that. Thank you.
Got it.
Anyone else?